Hello, everyone. Today for this podcast, we will talk about deaf education, specifically the unwritten curriculum. All schools, whether it is for public education, deaf education, or special education, all have to adhere to the state standards. Just like with other countries around the world, they all have their own set of standards they have to adhere to. Deaf, hearing, or special education students all have a set of curriculum resources available for purchase. They have this for liberal arts, math, social studies, science, physical education, and so forth. The unwritten curriculum, when it comes to deaf education, is the focus of this talk. The unwritten curriculum rules states that deaf people can be just like hearing people. So let's talk about the history of it. As you've already read, When the Mind Hears, and you've also read numerous articles pertaining to this assignment. I'm now going to go in more depth about this topic. These three books were all published in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. These books include fingerspelling and signs. The middle book, you can see the student with the ear horns working hard to lip read and speak, having to mimic speech repeatedly over and over again. Then the other book has fingerspellings and signs with some spoken language, but not heavily emphasized. The focus is on reading, writing, signing, and fingerspelling. The goal of this was to show that deaf individuals can think, feel, and have discussions. This was framed from a hearing person's perspective and experiences. That is our ongoing struggle with the unwritten curriculum for manualism. Manualism, which is signed language, and oralism, which focuses on speaking, and how these two philosophies are always in conflict. Regarding deaf education in America, there have been several curriculums developed by deaf individuals as of recent, but during the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, those were written by hearing individuals. Once deaf people became successful, like Jean Massue and Laurent Clerc, Massue's name sign is the hand shape of an M tucking into his pocket. This was due to him having several pocket watches and having one always in his pocket. Laurent Clerc's name sign is two fingers painting on his cheek because of a scar that he had. Here in America, Laurent Clerc was the first deaf educator. He started the American School for the Deaf. They allowed signing in the classroom and employed deaf educators. They welcomed deaf Black students, and this was in 1825, ages ago. They also welcomed deaf-blind students during that same year. They had established two tracks. One was for academics, and the other was a vocational track. Students would pick which track they wanted to pursue after choosing a path. And that time, college wasn't an option yet until Gallaudet was founded in 1864. Then the academic track became a more popular option, and which track the student would choose was up to their own personal interest. Prior to founding the American School for the Deaf, they had private oral schools. William Boley and John Braidwood had founded an oral school. That oral school was called Cobb School, and it was decommissioned in 1816. American School for the Deaf was founded in 1817, and they focused on the signing method. That's when signing spread like wildfires across the countries within classrooms. The southern states still had the oral focus, very much like the European countries. In Germany and in England, they were still proponents of oralism. Now I would like to talk about ASL and where it originated from. When you see this picture, you can see the children signing and fingerspelling with an older woman who is seated. This is MVSL, which is Martha Vineyard's sign language. It's in close proximity to Massachusetts and Cape Cod. Cape Cod is several islands, and one of those islands is called Martha's Vineyard. They had their own form of sign language. When the American School for the Deaf was founded in Connecticut, Laurent Clair, the first deaf teacher, had noticed when socializing with the students that some already had used several different sign languages. He noticed Indigenous people knew tribal sign language, and there were some students who had home signs that they brought with them as well. Laurent Clair utilized LSF, which is French Sign Language, and with a mixture of MVSL and LSF, and noticing how they eliminated Indigenous Sign Language and home signs, of course, because home sign language is not considered a true language. But sadly, several of the Indigenous people represented several tribes that had developed their own sign language was not adopted. What was adopted was Martha Vineyard Sign Language and LSF, and it was the marriage of those two languages is what becomes what we call American Sign Language. And this is an example of the unwritten curriculum, the values of a European, white, dominant hearing culture reflecting their values. Europeans prioritized speaking, oralism. They would try to fix deaf individuals through several experiments, as you have already read in the book, When the Mind Hears. There were several failed experimentations done on deaf individuals. Deaf education was focused on lip reading, oralism. Not in France, however. This was British and Germany, where these highly valued methodologies were to teach children to lip read. There was some influence of this methodology in France, just not prioritized as highly. The medical approach is to fix, and the educational approach was to teach oralism. And those two approaches combined was the marriage and birth special education. The reason why they have their hands over their eyes was that hearing people did not see them as deaf. They saw them becoming like themselves hearing. Hearing, being deaf, the deaf ways, deaf cultures was not accepted, and they were taught that they needed to be fixed. One way to do that was to focus on their ears and how to fix it, and another was through eugenics engineering. Speaking was the only way to communicate. Signing was prohibited. So focusing on the ears and the mouth and disregarding their eyes. And that's the marriage of the medical approach and deaf education and birthing special education. We do not view ourselves as needing special education. What we are is deaf education. The conflict continues between manualism and oralism. I do want to mention is Alexander Graham Bell, and he was one of the proponents of eugenics, mainstreaming education and banning sign language within schools, and preventing the marriage of deaf people to each other in hopes of preventing passing on the deaf gene. He was once quoted, "We should try ourselves to forget that these children are deaf. We should teach the children to forget that they are deaf. To make these children think, talk, act like they were hearing and not deaf." To accomplish this goal of thinking like a hearing person, this had to be done throughout the world. And this was done at a conference called the International Congress on Education of the Deaf, located in Milan. The Milan Conference was held in Milan, Italy in 1880s. As you can see on the paintings here, they have similar meanings through different periods. The Spanish artist named Goya, their painting, the 3rd of May, 1808, depicts the mass killings of the Hispanic culture. These were killings of the innocent people. Similarly, their other painting of Thornley's, the Milan, 1880, ASL was decimated and completely wiped out. The word ASL is included in this painting, but ASL is just a placeholder for any other signed languages across the world. They have the same principles, but this artist happened to be American, which is why the word ASL is displayed. Comparing 1808 and the year 1880, those numbers are just very similar. How the International Congress on Education of the Deaf was able to commit ASL genocide was by having teachers of the deaf from all over the world come to the Milan Conference. All of these educators were hearing. One of the leaders there was Alexander Graham Bell. He had brought students that were deaf and propped them up on stage to demonstrate their abilities to speak for themselves. With a captivated audience, they believed deaf people could be taught to speak, and the vast majority then voted to ban the use of sign language within the classroom. What was withheld from these educators was, in fact, that these children were post-literacy deaf, which means they became deaf after the age of 3. This also means they were able to start acquiring spoken language before becoming deaf. Any individual that becomes deaf after the age of 3 can develop spoken language, unlike children, those who are born deaf. Regardless of the fact, Alexander Graham Bell was able to deceive his audience and had a worldwide impact of banning the use of sign language from being delivered in the classroom. Hence, it was the slaughter of sign language and deaf individuals being considered human biodiversity people. I'm now going to introduce the unwritten curriculum within deaf education. But again, they refer to it as special education, but I'm going to refer to it as deaf education. This model is very Eurocentric, which is the medical model, which reflects autism. The attitude of the unwritten deaf curriculum is hearing and speaking fluency. This implies that oralism is far superior than sign language and is prioritized as such. Autism parallels racism and sexism. Through speaking and listening with repetition and teaching deaf children how to act like hearing individuals, how to think, talk, and act like hearing people. Do you remember that quote from earlier from Alexander Graham Bell? We should teach these children to forget that they are deaf, to teach them to be like hearing, and that's the hearingization process. Which means this impacts the child's behavior, their preferences, their expectation of life, who they marry, how they socialize, their values, perspectives, and cultures. Anything that had to do with being deaf or their characterization was removed, and hearingization was put in its place. This hearingization can be compared to the assimilation of cultures. But in reality, deaf people are lousy imitators of hearing people. The marriage of medicine and the educational model shows up in other ways. The first school for the deaf was actually called an asylum, which signified these poor people had to be taken care of and were inferior. When they realized these people could be taught, they changed the word from asylum to institution, but were still considered inferior. Eventually, that's when they changed the name to deaf school, but it's always been called for the deaf. Using the word for is the attitude adopted from this Eurocentric model, that deaf people have to be taken care of and have things done for them. We set the school up for you, we teach you, we do all these things for you. We need to change the wording to of the deaf, and it makes sense to keep the funding sources the same from the government and the states to support this, just using taxpayer dollars just like public schools, but we don't refer to public schools as for the hearing children. Public elementary schools are just elementary schools, keeping it the same, referring to deaf schools just as deaf schools. Doing away with the word would be beneficial, but this topic is for another day. Mainstreaming or isolate streaming children was the philosophy held by Alexander Graham Bell, and this was a concept that he had developed. This was his goal. He wanted deaf children to be separated from each other to force them into socialization of hearing children, and then accomplishing his goal by doing away with the deaf gene. This is the medical and educational model and the marriage of the two. Now to focus on the Eurocentric medical model and the impact that it had on Black deaf schools during segregation. It was the same to Native American schools. They had to join in with other schools. Very Eurocentric philosophy of teaching where they had to adapt oralism, where they had to assimilate into this white hearing culture. This was forcing and oppressing Black deaf children as well as Indigenous deaf children. White deaf children were also oppressed, as well as other minority groups, and this is the unwritten curriculum. Role models and the use of sign language were all based on white hearing Eurocentric model. Within the schooling education of the Black deaf schools and the Indigenous deaf children, they were kept separate, but not equal curriculums. That also follows the unwritten model for children. As you can see, they try to bring back sign language within the classrooms. Remember, from the 1880s up until that point, it was oralism only and sign language was banned. Within the Black deaf schools, they still were able to sign, but was still heavily influenced of the oralism. As mentioned earlier, deaf educators either lost their jobs or would have to switch to the vocational track to teach. This information is you're already familiar with as it was discussed in prior readings, and as you can see, the detrimental effect that it had. a deaf person named Ryan Holcomb in the year 1974 and 1975 tried to come up with a way to bring sign language back within the classroom. And he came up with total communication. This is when a teacher would have to meet all the different styles of communication with each student. Some students were oral, some might have signed fluently, or some signed more English-like, or some used cued speech or a written mode of communication. And the teacher would have to modify their curriculum day after day to match each student within their classroom. It obviously failed. It was predominantly English-based, and it was impossible to tailor each curriculum to each individual student, and oftentimes teacher would just ignore the students who used ASL and focused on those who could speak or use signed English. Over time, the students that used signed English would then transition to speaking only and would stop signing altogether. As you can see, it's still very Euro-white-centric model-based and was used to oppress their students. Shortly thereafter, in 1979, there was a deaf woman named Dr. Geraldine Gustafson, and with two other hearing individuals was trying to think of some methodological signing. If you remember, Abbe Sicard also used methodological signing, just like his predecessor, Abbe de Lepi. Laurent Claire had also rejected that form of signing. Just like with signing exact English and pigeoned signed English, those are following English formats, but putting it in the air and adding things like, I am going to the stores, by adding initialized signs and articles. So that's signing exact English. And there are several examples within that one, but you get the idea. Pigeoned signed English, or PSE, is I go to store. Does that make sense to you? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. And you cannot even speak English properly in, let's say, a Japanese word order. Could you? As you can see, each individual language has its own grammatical structure, just like sign language does. ASL, which is signed here in America. You have LSF, which is signed in France. Germany uses DSG, and as you can see, every country out there has its own form of sign language, and the conflict that happens when trying to add spoken languages to their sign language, and the ongoing conflict that happens. So now to frame this towards deaf education and the mainstreaming law, we'll talk about least restricted environment, which happened in 1975. The reason why I chose this Dan Newton picture, it's a funny sitcom called Seinfeld, is based on the character and how it parallels to LRE. When you control the mail, you control the information, and that's what least restrictive environment is. Dr. Larry Newman, a deaf person, was involved with the committee and had discussions about this law, PL 94-142. When they proposed the least restrictive environment law, it was framed towards deaf individuals, which means deaf individuals need to have direct access to communication, which means talking to their peers or teachers directly using sign language. However, the hearing individuals on this committee interpreted it differently. They assumed this meant they needed to mainstream deaf children because that's what LRE meant to them, was mainstreaming. Even though the deaf advocates said our interpretation of LRE means language-rich environment. So as you can see, there was a conflict between the two philosophies. Regardless of how you define it, LRE is the same, having direct access to your peers, teachers, and your environment by all using the same language sign language. There's still more that needs to be done with deaf education, but that is the definition. As you can see on this PowerPoint slide, this is the traditional language planning for K-12 education in the United States. There's nothing wrong with it. It is appropriate for children who are able to hear to focus on oralcy and literacy. No changes are needed. For deaf children, the unwritten curriculum also adheres to this, trying to mimic this model into deaf education, which is another example of autism and heritization. The marriage of medical and educational and the birth of special education. Deaf advocates push for the removal of heritization from this philosophy. The missing piece within the deaf education was signacy. So having all three of these philosophies, and signacy was the missing crucial piece within deaf education. And this slide shows you the language abilities model. This is true deaf education and not special education. As you can see, signacy is also included on this model. You also have literacy, which is required for all children, regardless if they're deaf, hard of hearing, or a cochlear implant user. The third option being oralcy, which we still do provide to these children as long as they have access to any hearing, which could be done through residual hearing, a cochlear implant, or hearing aids. In addition, this child has the ability to speak, but it will never be equivalent to their peers. And this is a very individualized to each child, and that encompasses deaf education, signacy, literacy, and oralcy being for some students, but the first two is mandatory for all of these students. The classrooms here are bilingual. For here in America, that would be ASL and English. If you lived in France, the bilingual approach would be LSF and French. In Germany, it would be DSG and German. And this would allow students to thrive. Teachers in the classroom have appropriate teaching methods, which is the bilingual teaching methodology, which is very strategic. And each teacher can modify that to ensure students gain fluency within both languages, which in turn impacts their identity in a positive way. They can feel connected to each of their cultures, deaf culture, hearing culture, and cultures within their own family unit. Then the students themselves would not view themselves as disabled. They would view themselves as a language cultural minority, which has a positive impact due to being bilingual within a deaf ed classroom. Getting rid of the unwritten curriculum is absolute. And to finish it off with the last slide, you can see all the different colors that represents the diversity of people within the deaf community. There's so much diversity and abilities, fluencies, identities, and cultures, and this is depicted in a positive way within deaf education.